Welcome, everybody. So pleased to welcome you to another session from the Ecom 2021 conference. We're into our final afternoon of sessions, and I'm very pleased today to introduce you to both Jeff Stickney. I'll do that formally in a minute, who's our presenter, but also to Emiko Newman, who is one of our graduate students at OISE, who'll be helping out behind the scenes. So welcome to all who have joined the session, and we encourage you to participate by popping comments and questions into the chat, and I think Jeff is going to provide a couple opportunities for conversation as well throughout the session. Just a reminder that this is part of the water education theme, one of the 4 co-themes for this conference. And we are going to begin with land acknowledgement.
Hey, thank you. So welcome everyone. Today we wish to acknowledge the traditional territory upon which the conference is being hosted. For many thousands of years, the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit have sought to walk gently on this land. The territory is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. This acknowledgement signals our desire to seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based on honor and deep respect, and is a starting point to remind us all to enact this work in our personal and professional lives.
Thank you so much, Emiko. Well, at this point, I'd like to introduce you to Jeff Stickney. I feel very lucky to have Jeff as one of my colleagues at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. The walk he's about to take you through is one that he takes his students through as part of OISE's Environmental and Sustainability Education course. He's also led this session for TDSV teachers at OISE's Climate Action Conference last October and at Oxford last March for the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain conference. He has his MA in geography as well as his doctorate from the University of Toronto. Jeff, welcome.
Well, thanks so much, Hillary and Emiko. Really a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Out of habit, I checked the weather this morning to make sure we have really no chance of thunderstorms as we go out for our walk. And I thought, oh, of course, we're online rather than being here in person. But you know, if we were going out today, often I would have sunblock, and I'd be saying, hey, let's make sure we have comfortable shoes, and we would have to go down the elevator, and then we would meet under, there's a black walnut tree just outside of the OISE doors. And one of the questions I would ask people, I said, did any of you notice this black walnut tree? And almost nobody sees the tree because it's growing into a TTC building. And as it's growing out, it has absorbed part of the chain link fence. And every 2 years, it drops its walnuts down onto the ground, probably hitting some cars. That's maybe the only way we notice its presence there. But when we talk about where is nature, sometimes where do we look? You know, is that tree part of nature? We're doing a walk today where we're trying to have an encounter with nature. And we talk about getting out of dismal buildings like OISE in order to have nature encounters. But that's one of the questions or themes I want you to think about today. And it's one that I've carried through some of our earlier workshops. I've really enjoyed hearing other speakers talk about ways of getting students out to encounter nature in urban areas. I really appreciated the work they're doing. And at one point we were asking, you know, how many of you have frequent encounters with nature? And I thought it was interesting that many people said they didn't have frequent ones. And I thought that's interesting because most of our body is host to microorganisms too small for us to see. We are a biome. We are a natural ecosystem, and our microbiome, our guts, we carry these creatures. So it's a movement in ecological thinking today is to question whether there even is a barrier between human and nature. Bruno Latour is doing this, for instance, in some of his recent work since 2018, and even philosophers like Slavoj Žižek from Hungary, raise this question. So do we get caught in a binary? And is that in fact a rather anthropocentric way to even raise the question? So when we get down to the Leapskin crystal, I'm going to ask you to look at the crystal there, the glass structure, and look at the brick and ask yourself, is one more natural than the other? And where do we find nature as we meander down the Taddle Creek path into Philosopher's Walk? So, having some idea of what the takeaways might be on a trip like this is a good idea. And it might be subject related. I know some of you have taught science, or some of you might be teaching in other specific areas like geography. And then you might have very clear expectations of what you want the students to take away from this. I do these talks often with teacher candidates from all different teachable subjects. So I have to make my excursions more multidisciplinary or cross-curricular in order to engage them. So, I want my music students to also feel that this is of relevance to them. So can we talk about soundscapes, or art students, and then get them doing activities where we're drawing as well as talking about environmental science. So it's cross-disciplinary, but it's also genealogical in the sense that I also want to move us back and forth in time, go back into the past, and also kind of go forward and ask some questions of what will this place be like 200 years from now. So if we can play some of these games together, I think it'll be fun. And then I don't know about you, but it's really tiring on Zoom. So I'm trying to think, how can I make this more authentic? If we were on a really real walk, we would stop at certain places, landmarks like the beech tree in Taddle Creek Park and the boulder down in Philosopher's Walk. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to come off share screen, stop my PowerPoint and say, okay, stop the slides, and invite you then, if you want to put your video on then and unmute, and then we can maybe have a little more engagement that way. I'm worried about leaving all of the question and answer to the end and then not getting to it. So if we can agree to do that. But I will go to share screen now, and I'll click through some slides fairly quickly because the content is easily accessible. I'm going to give you a copy of a paper I wrote for the Journal of Philosophy of Education. I was co-editing a special issue on climate crisis. It was education, environment, and sustainability. And as the co-editor, I contributed this piece on Philosopher's Walk. So you can get all the links and the material, the content through that, as well as I'm giving you a Word doc on getting acquainted with trees. And so things like URLs for getting video clips and things like that. You can get all of those off that Word doc, including at the end when we get into Queen's Park. I have this activity that the ROM created, which is find 5 species of oak tree. Students love doing that. So there's a handout, but I'm giving you the link so you can find that. And thanks, Amiko, for loading that in at the end of the talk. Let's go to share screen. And so we're looking at our local watershed, and I was talking to Hillary, maybe that's why I ended up in the water group rather than the urban environment as classroom, but it's really a combination of both. And so if I go through and look at the 1818 map of Toronto, I was pointing this out in one of the sessions we were in this morning. This is Queen Street here, and it used to be called Lot Street. That's because in the British grid system, all the lots began from there. And members of government, when they came here from down in Niagara on the lake and earlier from Kingston, as they moved the seat of government here, they were rewarded for their move by giving them large 100-acre lots from Queen Street all the way up to Bloor Street. This is the one where the AGO is. That's our oldest brick building in Toronto. So built in 1818, Darcy Bolton's mansion. Now, the members gallery at the AGO. But when you're doing a walk on Philosopher's Walk, I mean, you're on this estate, you're just at the back part of it, as is all of U of T. This is Peter Russell's slave plantation. He was the president of Upper Canada, and it ran from Queen all the way back to Eglinton. Now the U of T has just changed Russell Street to be named after Ursula Franklin, a Holocaust survivor, feminist, and physicist, and it may be a better way. So when we look at, what is our history and what are we proud of and what are we ashamed of, and this is one of the interesting things. A lot of people don't know that there was a slave plantation, and then he advertised one of his slaves for sale and her son separately in the York Gazette back in the early 18th century, end of the 18th century and early 19th century. So this is what it would have looked like, these creeks. This is Russell Creek, named after him, came down here past the center of government, and then Taddle Creek meandered down here, still is there. I mean, they have sump pumps in the basements of Ryerson and the Sutton Hotel, these different places, because the water still has to make its way down from the Oak Ridges moraine in this watershed. But this is sort of this lovely picture of children playing in these kinds of streams. It just reminds us of how bucolic this would have been back in the 19th century. when it first appeared. I'm also reminded, and thanks for the land recognition, there were pathways along these creeks and natural pathways. When you look at Davenport Street in Toronto, you realize, oh, that's right, that was a portage trail for carrying canoes up from Lake Ontario all the way up to Lake Simcoe and up to Georgian Bay. This is where they dammed up Taddle Creek in order to create a swimming hole in front of Hart House, and it was also for for skating in the winter time. I'm going through this fairly quickly, I know. It's because, if we were on a walk right now, we'd probably be stretched out over 100 meters. Some people standing beside me talking and other people at the back chatting with each other. And then we would congregate. So now we're a block north of OISE at Taddle Creek Park. And there's this wonderful fountain that reminds us that, hey, a little stream used to run through here. I sometimes would have students sit around here, but then you're in full sunlight. So what I tend to do is go back into the shade here. My daughter used to play here at the age of 1. She's turning 39 this year, so I guess that dates me, doesn't it? But I can see, here's where Taddle Creek, this is its flooding area here. And then when you look at the old maps, you can see the shape of the river influenced the design of the city. It really shows up as well on the next map as well. You can see the shape of the river changing the course of the housing. What happened were these creeks became an impediment to urban expansion. So as the city moved north of Queen Street, these creeks got in the way, and they had to drain them and divert them then into the sewer system. And you can sometimes see houses in Toronto that are leaning. If you put a marble on the ground, they never stop rolling because they're built on the creek bed and then they're sinking into the sandy soil. So be careful. I used to always check out these 19th century maps before buying a house downtown. Where's the water all coming from? Well, all the water along the Great Lakes, it flows into Lake Superior, then into Lake Huron, then into Lake Erie, then into Lake Ontario, and out to St. Lawrence. I mean, that is our major drainage basin, isn't it? And then north of here, it flows up into Hudson Bay, Mississippi down to the Gulf of Mexico. So, I mean, that's large scale drainage basins that I would explain to our students. But then our local watershed, think of David Crombie, our mayor of Toronto, conservative, but very active in our conservation authorities. He's one of the first people to advocate doing watershed planning for our city, because whatever you do up on the Moraine, it has an impact down in Toronto and vice versa. So I'd often point out to my students that at Ashbridges Bay, that's where our water treatment plants are. And that's where everything we flush up in Oak Ridges, where I live, goes down there, down by Ashbridges Bay, and then it gets cleansed before going out into the lake. But then a kilometer away at the Harris Waterworks, we pump that water back up, store it in great reservoirs under some of our soccer fields up here. And then that's what we're drinking. So, I mean, we are in this loop. And so we need to think about a watershed and not do things like pour oil from a oil change from a car in the ground up here on the Moraine and not worry about where it goes, because we know it's going to end up in our drinking water. So it's one of the takeaways for our students, just to understand what is a watershed and where's the water going. North of the Moraine, it goes up into Lake Simcoe. South, it drains down here into Lake Ontario. Nice to see people joining us. So we're talking about the drainage pattern for Taddle Creek and as it flows. I live up in the Lake Wilcox area. So in fact, this morning, I walked through the Jefferson Forest and then went down here and I stood right here and I was looking at how calm the lake was. I could see the geese and ducks and swans. We had loons out here. It's really a nice little kettle lake. This was left behind by a big block of ice during the last ice ages as the ice receded north about 11,000 years ago. So we remember that we're part of the Wisconsinian glaciation, and it's left behind these kettle lakes up here, really quite lovely. And then this is the headwaters of the Rouge and also the East Humber River. I go kayaking out on here. It's really quite lovely. But just that's an appreciation of where does this water come from for Taddle Creek. We have math students also, and for some of my math teacher candidates, they might be wondering, well, why are we going on a walk? What am I going to learn from this? Well, Benoit Mandelbrot is the person who wrote about the geometry of nature, and he looked at fractal geometries, similar patterns in nature. And when you look at dendritic systems, rivers and branching patterns from trees and capillaries in our own body, they tend to follow these replicating patterns. So I share with my students a little bit about fractal geometry, but also in the great math mystery, these wonderful documentaries that NOVA puts out, they point out that flower petals follow the Fibonacci series. So you can find math, wherever you wish to look. One of our professors at OISE, Ron Lancaster, does math walks, and he's kindly recorded those, and I share those with my students. And a lot of people now teaching during COVID are wondering, well, what can we do? We can go outside. It doesn't matter what subject you're using. And I know Susan McNabb from our faculty at OISE also takes her math candidates out to Philosopher's Walk, as do I, to experience what's going on there from a different focal point. I've got finally to the park, and here the first thing I want to share is this lovely copper beech tree. I have to admit, I didn't know it was a copper beech at first, and I probably misidentified it a few times. And then somebody showed me the Leaf Snap app, and there's also iNaturalist, these wonderful ways. With iNaturalist, you can be a citizen scientist and also record information. But if you put the leaf on a white sheet of paper, take a picture of it, it gives you, using an algorithm, it gives you the probability of what tree species it is. They're not always accurate, but this is a good identification. So this is a wonderful place to sit because it has a natural amphitheater, this little concrete ring that goes around it. And now we're sitting in the shade and able to talk about the tree. But I've already used technology to talk about what species is. It doesn't matter. Maybe not. Another way to experience this wonderful, majestic tree is through poetry. C.D. Wright, when she passed away, they posthumously published her poems, Casting Deep Shade. It's all about beech trees and people's love of beech trees. And beech trees sometimes remind us of the legs of elephants. And there's all these imaginative connections we have with them, going back to our childhood. So I just want to remind you, for my English teachers, for instance, they might be wondering, well, what are we going to get when we go out here? Well, we once did slam poetry under that beech tree. It was really quite lovely, and it was a way of experiencing it. I often think of these trees as having a presence, a storied presence. I can locate it here in the park, but it's much older than the park. And in fact, it's older than the city of Toronto itself. So this would have been here when the creek ran through, long before there were residential streets. So I have a picture of an ent here because I'm thinking of this as one of the local ents. I love how the Toronto Star does a feature on local trees. This one made it in once, the Annex Silver Maple. And you can see the children here. This is about 2 blocks away. Just walk down Lowther Street. So I take my teacher candidates down there. A little awkward peering into a daycare area as a bunch of adults, but we're appreciating that if we have something like Louv's nature deficit, is this a way for young children to overcome that? And you often see children hugging this tree and sometimes even hiding behind it or crying when they need a timeout and if they're having a hard day. Really quite lovely. Here's a leaf snap of one of the leaves there. Okay, we're back at the tree. And like I said, I would, not be doing a PowerPoint. We would be maybe pausing here. So I'm going to pose my first question to you, which I always share with my students as we're sitting here. And now I would be passing out paper and pencil, and we might start a drawing activity. And I'm beginning to maybe talk a bit about the botany, the botanical science of the tree. I have a lot of things I want to introduce, but to introduce all of this, I asked this question. Sitting here or standing here, are you now inside or outside this tree? Okay, so if you want to, I'm going to go off share screen and we can look at one another. And if you want to, bring your cameras on. Hi, Catherine. See a student here. What are different ways you can take up that question? I did this with a group of philosophers at Oxford, and they all suspect it's a trick, right? Aha, so they immediately go to the non-obvious answer. But what would be a reason for an answer you would give? Give an answer and explain why. How are you either in or outside that tree?
If you're under the shade, you're covered by the tree.
Very good. That's right. And for many of us, we might be getting sunburnt, if we didn't have that protection. And wonderful how trees have that array to maximize their collection of incoming sunlight for photosynthesis. It is really amazing, their capacity. Good answer, Catherine. What else? So you're within its shade. In that sense, you're inside of its lower radiant temperatures and ambient temperatures. I like that one.
I see myself being part of its ecosystem.
Ooh. What does that mean, Sandra, to be part of its ecosystem? Just elaborate. You're an outdoor educator with many, so I know like you are an expert in this area. I always learn from you.
So you're interacting with the abiotic and the biotic factors of the tree and thinking about the roots underneath you and the air exchange, the gas exchange, and the interactions with the other living elements in its area.
Yeah. And you and I once walked up to the park together, and you were looking at laying out grid to then try to get a sampling of different species of grasses and what we might call weeds. And I thought that was a really neat activity for science students then and then looking at different species in this park. I mean, it was really fun. So that's what you were doing from a science lens, and it was fun to collaborate on that. So part of a common ecosystem. What else? Is anyone going to argue that we're outside the tree? That's the obvious answer, isn't it?
Well, we're not inside the core trunk, which is maybe why we could argue we're not outside. But can I put forth another idea that
Sure.
if we are within a physical distance of that tree, that we're also within connection of it as a living being, and therefore maybe in the affective space, that's affective with an A, emotional space of the tree as well.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Yeah. You know, and so many authors, I'm thinking of Colin Tudge, The Secret Lives of Trees, how they live and why they matter. I mean, he has whole chapters on how they communicate, looking at Peter Wohlleben on the hidden lives of trees, what they feel and how they communicate. So when you talked about the affective domain of trees, I'd be, oh, come on, what are you talking about here, Hillary? And yet a lot of eminent scientists are now talking that way. As is Diane Beresford-Kroeger, our Irish-Canadian tree expert, who then this is to speak for the trees and really talking about her journey with trees. It's full of the interconnections we have that way, and her documentary, Call of the Forest, is one of the ones I highly recommend that you look at. I had the wonderful occasion to collaborate on a paper with her last summer.
I'd like to maybe add that our keynote speaker this morning talked a little bit differently about canopies and communities, which I forget his actual term, sorry, but we're forming a community under that tree ourselves. And so therefore we're really part of that tree.
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful point, Andrea. And I remember once I arrived with my class and there were already two people sitting there, and that, well, it sounded like I booked it. And so now you're into these ownership and social justice issues. And what we did is we compromised, and I invited them to be part of it, so absorption. And then they joined the community. And I'm not sure, but I mean, that could be difficult. What if there was somebody sleeping there, protection from the rain, a homeless person? This is happening more now, so with COVID. And so then these are interesting social justice issues about the social space we occupy and then share with these trees. Thank you.
Can I add about forest bathing? So how we interact and benefit from the chemical exchange. A lot of research in that area right now.
Yeah, and Diane Beresford-Kroeger's book, Global Forests, talks about this, but then her documentary, Call of the Forest, she talks about how the compressive forces within the tree, you think of these massive branches, they have compression and suspension joints to hold these up. Try holding your arms out like a tree and you realize, whoa, that is really hard to do. As an architect, I defy it. There's an interesting lattice under the bark that helps support this. But what happens under these compressive forces is aerosol gases are created and they are released. So alpha and beta pinene, limonene, and then these are sometimes, healthful properties in there, anti-cancer properties from these gases. So the Japanese go forest bathing. I've done that in Kyoto, quite amazing, to go breathe in the aerosol gases. So you're right, you are in a gas sphere. And some scientists believe that this helps students who have learning disabilities and wonder, is that the origin of the tree of wisdom that we find, whether it's in Buddhism or, in Genesis and other places. Even the symbol for University of Toronto is the oak tree. Quercus is our system that we use for our computer system. So we often look to trees as a symbol of knowledge and wisdom, in that sense, being under their canopy. Lovely. I'm glad you added forest bathing. Now, the one that I'm going to go to, I'm going to go back to share screen. Thanks for those lovely contributions. And this was from Neil Everden, who did his doctorate at OISE, and he was using Martin Heidegger as his philosopher. And he talked about a tree being not so much a thing as a rhythm of exchange, a center of organizational forces. So he's talking about transpiration and how water flows through the root system up under the cambium layer of the bark, the nearest layer. And you can actually hear it surging if you have a hydrophone, which we don't, but I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. And then that water makes itself up through the xylem all the way to the tips of the leaves, where at the bottom of the leaves, there's a little mouth called the stoma. And then that's where through evapotranspiration, water leaves. And again, now you're in sort of a hydrosphere of this tree, not just gases like limonene and alpha and beta pinene, but a hydrosphere. And then it's also then drawing in carbon and sequestering that into its heartwood, into its trunk, and then also creating sugars for energy and sending that down into its roots through the phloem. So there's a whole system here that you're in. And he talks about this like a gravitational field. But what you realize, I mean, it seems strange here. He says, we think of this sometimes, as a strange object. We can barely imagine what it looks like. I mean, it's a tree form that appears to us. When you ask children to draw a tree, they almost never add the roots in, which might be a quarter and sometimes even up to a half the mass of the tree, depends on the species. So we tend to only think of the part above ground, and then they're doing that miss the bottom of the tree, which can be really robust. These are beech tree roots. And look at how massive this area is that they spread out and cover when they're revealed through erosion. And so this is that aspect of evapotranspiration that we might miss if we didn't really think more deeply. This is Judy Dench, and in her documentary, My Passion for Trees, she has a scientist. I gave a link here. If you just type in Judy Dench listening to trees, you'll find this. But they use these microphones, and then they pick up both the sound of the tree moving in the wind. Again, it's there's a lot of creaking going on that we can't hear. Elephants maybe would hear this infrasound, but then also the water surging upward. And so you're inside of that circulatory system of a root system that reaches out way past those concrete barriers that we're sitting on, for instance, as we're sitting here. And then this brings us into Diane Beresford-Kroeger and also Suzanne Simard and their botanical science and chemistry that they're sharing with us on how trees share nutrients, mother trees and hub trees, with their offspring, but also with other species. I'm showing you here, this is evergreen oak tree, Quercus ileus, and its offspring in Kew Gardens in London. And if you looked under the ground, the root systems will be interconnected, and the mother tree will be sending nutrients. But also if a deer comes to nibble, they used to have these fallow deer in England. They brought them in from France. They would nibble on the leaf over here. The mother tree will send a warning, an electrochemical signal to the offspring to increase its production of tannins to make its leaves bitter to the taste. And so these trees are communicating and they're competing with one another and with others. I mean, in some ways they're at war with each other by changing the pH value of the soil. Look, when I ask students what grows under a pine tree, they go, well, not much, nothing, because those needles are so acidic. Now, again, I have English teachers with me, and so I'm going to share the Overstory by Richard Powers, who kindly did a little introduction on the cover for Diane Beresford-Kroeger. He used Diane Beresford-Kroeger and Suzanne Simard to create a fictional character, Patricia Westerford, in the wonderful novel, The Overstory. It's all about trees, sequoias and other trees. Talks about Pando in Utah. It's 40,000 trembling aspen trees that are connected through the root system, and it reproduces sexually with seeds, but also through cloning. And it's really just amazing. It's been alive for 1 million years. And that's one of the largest supraorganisms we know of on our planet, one of the largest living and longest living beings, and so we should have some sort of reverence for them, and then appreciate the symbiosis, the commonality between fungus and trees, which made life possible on Earth if you go way back to the beginning of the Paleozoic era and the dawn of life on our planet. So learning about mycorrhizal networks is so important. And I think for a lot of the students, that's an aha moment. But for other students, they might be going, well, you know, what can I learn more about this? Vanessa Elsap from our science department, she and I went out and looked at the tree and measured its circumference. And, you know, she does this with her science students. And then you can enter the circumference into a tree calculator, tree age calculator, and also a carbon calculator, and try and find out how much carbon is sequestered there. She and I estimated the tree is maybe 260 years old, hence older than Canada. And that's really kind of neat. So there are these apps that you can bring into your classroom, and again, bring math and science in. Now, you know, I'm teaching during a pandemic, and so I can't take my students to the beech tree. But hey, here's a lovely 3 beech trees in the Jefferson Forest. I walked by these this morning as I was heading down to the lake. Here's my partner Karen sitting in front of them. So now for my students, I'm doing place-based education online, as we are right now, because this was supposed to be a walk outdoors. I can give them links to Suzanne Simard's documentaries. I did a fun thing where I took a dozen videos off YouTube on how trees talk. And I said, well, as educators, which ones do you think are most effective with teenagers? You know, think about 4 minutes, 18 minutes visually. And that was kind of a fun way to pull them in to then assessing them and then, you know, considering how they would use them. I also go out with my phone. I take my own video footage, and then I can save that on my computer and then upload it to a U of T library, my media space, and then make it accessible. You wouldn't be able to open this without a University of Toronto ID, but maybe you could use Vimeo or something, or on your school board website, be able to store videos. So using your phone is great. So I get my students to go out and do their own place-based learning. They can't come down to OISE, so go out in your own neighborhood. And students have really been enjoying this. I've had students go down into Grenadier Pond and talk about biology, English teacher candidate looking at Indian Road area and looking at the indigenous history, and then looking at flora and fauna. So for a lot of students, this has been one of the most meaningful assessments and activities, and they've really taken to it in urban areas or in remote areas. So I've inserted audio. Tree. I went to a local beech tree in my area. But you get, you know, so you can insert audio, and then that way it does make the file size a little bit bigger. Now, again, I want my students to appreciate that through artistic perception, you can form a bond with a tree, which is fairly unique. So this is from Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological essay on eye and mind, where he's citing artist Paul Klee, who talks about how he feels the trees are looking back at him, but he feels this oneness with the trees. And what I find is the students, when they're drawing the tree, a lot of them say that they feel this affinity with the tree. And I said, well, you don't need to represent the tree. A lot of people say, I'm not a good artist. I can't draw like so-and-so. I said, well, why don't you just draw your feelings for the tree? It doesn't have to be a likeness. What if you add words in and make it somewhat poetic? And now they're in. What if you write lyrics about if you were to make a song for this tree, or pick out a part of it that you thought was really interesting? At that beech tree, there's part of a telephone line that's absorbed by the tree. And then one of the interesting questions in the Overstory, they asked this question about when people put initials in the tree, do they grow as the tree gets higher? I don't know. What do you think, folks? Do the initials move up over time as the tree gets bigger?
No.
Anyone want to shout out? What's that?
They don't.
They don't, says Catherine. Thank you. Why don't they, Catherine?
Because they only undergrow primary growth, like going upward and downward at the tips and at the bottom roots.
So the branches grow at the tips, and it'll get wider, obviously one ring at a time, a little less so during a dry year. So it's growing outward, and they're not moving up, unless it's on a branch. And so that's one of those really fun little things. Yeah, that's really interesting. And then we're thinking then of how this tree then is reaching out over a wide area, how we're within it. And I often pause, and I might even ask them, well, right now as we're sitting here, are you inside or outside the sun? And I go, oh, no, this is like too Zen. When you think about it, if you're inside the sun, literally you would be burning up. But if you're outside the sun in the depths of space, it's minus 240 degrees Celsius, you'd be frozen solid. So again, you're in its ambient energy, it is in its gravitational field. And in a very strange way, you are the material of the sun right now thinking about itself. And so these kind of meditations are really fun with students. From phenomenological, philosophical perspective with Martin Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and others, they would argue that you're with the tree, in German, Mitsein, with its being, you're one with its being. The minute you saw the tree and recognized it as a tree. Now, I know this is really strange, but it's called the as structure of our language, where from young up you acquired a grammar and you see through that grammar. And an indigenous grammar is different from one from a Western language, and all different languages have slightly different grammatical ways of construing or making up the things we see. So, I mean, when you look in the distance here and you see the playground, I could say slide, wagon, et cetera, and you immediately see them in a nanosecond and recognize them as those things. That's what he means by being inside of language. So phenomenologists like Heidegger talk then about how we dwell in language and then we see nature through language, not as it appears in and of itself. So again, that question, where is nature? In a sense, we're partly making it up through our perceptual field as we look out upon it, rather than it being neutral and independent of us. Okay, we just made our way a block south, and then as we walked in front of the Royal Conservatory, I would point out the boulevard trees. They're elm trees. How nice to see those back after Dutch elm disease. But now we're at the Princess Gates, and here's the Leapskin crystal of glass, and then here's the old yellow brick and limestone old ROM. And it's very hard for students to not see this as unnatural and this as being more natural. But what makes that more natural than this? I mean, they're both, this brick is just made of mud, we bake mud. And what is glass? Glass is sand. It's the liquid state of sand, and then we add metals in order to reinforce it. And so is one more natural than the other? Inside the Leapskin crystal, the anthropology exhibit, there are shrunken heads from the Yanomami and Araro tribe of the Brazilian rainforest. And when some of them exterminated some of the miners coming in who were wiping out indigenous people with assault rifles and things like that, I mean, they cut them up and left them at the edge of the forest. The Brazilian government had to decide, are those indigenous people in our social contract under the law of Brazil, or are they in what Rousseau would call a state of nature and therefore not bound by the laws of Brazil? So, I mean, these, what people are even in a state of nature versus in a societal form of governance, a social contract. This is where TD Bank made a little place where you can sit on these Paleozoic blocks of shale. It's kind of nice. You can sit here and talk to students, but then there's a plaque that gives a land recognition. It's always strange to have a land recognition given to you by a bank. But one of the things I would point out to the students here is that this area was underwater 15,000 years ago. There was a larger Great Lake here, Lake Iroquois, and then that receded, went out further than our current lake shore, and then came back up. So all of this would have been underwater at one time. But as we get down into the park now, I also raise questions about, well, whose space is this? Who feels comfortable being here? Students, professors, certainly, but what about you? We raised the question of homeless people, pulling off of Julian's talk this morning. Who feels comfortable walking hand in hand here or being affectionate on a bench? Who has a right to sit on a bench? Issue that Julian raised here. Whose space is this? Well, it is part of the University of Toronto property, but in another way, a very public space. And we forget sometimes that the roofs in this area are also now in many cases green roofs, like on top of the ROM and athletic building. Now, as an educator, I planted some ideas here. Sorry for the pun, Hillary, but I now want to build on these. So I take them to the horse chestnut tree and we kick around some horse chestnuts and then say, hey, you realize the roots here go under the path and they're reaching all the way over to the cherry blossom trees here, or I take them up on the knoll here, and then you can see the exposed roots. And so the notion of a wood wide web of trees exchanging energy and communicating sometimes over, a couple hundred kilometers, that idea now, oh yeah, I sort of get it. Trees are not individuals, they're members of communities. But I want to come back to the cherry blossom tree here. They're really interesting. We're not able to go visit cherry blossom trees now. U of T is planting more because they're really popular at commencement. But these were planted in sorrow because of the 14 women who were killed at Ecole Polytechnique. So this is a commemorative space. And these flowers, again, 14 flowers, a plaque reminding us of that horrible event, a mass killing. But I often pause here and I ask the students, did you notice that the trunk of these trees is wider than here? You see these little bumps here. They don't know why. Does anyone know why that is? I'll throw out a question here. Anyone know why the trunk is wider here? And all of these trees, these are in Japan, but I needed an image where it's very much like this. Yeah?
The trees grafted?
Yes, exactly. So you chop down, into it. You use either an apple or plum tree. They're from the same genus, the Plymouth genus, and so they're compatible. And then you have a tree that is more native, that grows better in our soil here, and that gives these foreign species a better chance than of growing. So this is that question again, like, is it human nature to tamper with nature? That's a fun thing. We talk about genetic engineering, bonsai trees, another really good example of where we change the form of nature. And then is that part of human nature? And then to what extent? And when is it damaging? And when is it simply fun that we're playing with things? But now I want to pause at this boulder here because there's this plaque. And as we think about the age of these women whose lives were snuffed out way too early, 22, 24, it's such a brief moment in time. And that, of course, is in human time. In the Overstory, they often talk about tree time because oak trees live for sometimes 800 to 1,000 years, and so tree time is really different from human time, but also from geologic time. So I'm going to come out here, but let's talk about this boulder together. So I'm going to stop share again. And again, if you want to bring your cameras on, I went out to my backyard. I brought in, this is a piece of banded gneiss from Georgian Bay. And when you think of that rock, it was rounded, wasn't it? It was brought down here by the ice ages, and it doesn't actually belong here. They're called glacial erratics. Error in it because it's not the local bedrock. The local bedrock here is shale, sedimentary rock, and it's much older. This rock was formed around 3 billion years ago when two continents collided up at Georgian Bay during the Grenville orogeny, mountain forming, and it heated up the rock, and the radiation in the igneous rock made the rock become plastic and actually start flowing. So you go up in the Thousand Island areas, Georgian Bay, you see all this rock that was flowing. And in fact, this is basalt. This is from volcanic eruption, and then the lava settled out here, and then it goes back into banded layers of igneous rock where it's resettled. So metamorphic, it's changed its former structure, but then it makes its way down here from billions of years ago during this time when there was a mountain chain higher than the Alps, in that area that is now eroded down. So we think about geologic time and how we fit into geologic time. But here's another question for us when we look at that rock and we think about its really old age. Can we think of that rock as also at the same time, not only being, for us, we experience it as being very hard. Do we have any physicists in our group here? In what sense is this mostly empty space?
I can't answer that question for you, Jeff. As you know, I'm not a physicist, but I do need to give you a 5-minute warning because we have to land. We have to end right at 2:20.
Good, and we're almost done, and we're creating our dialogue now. Ionic bonds are holding this thing together, but it's mostly empty space. And that's that strange thing, as is the ground you're walking on. And as we're standing there by the rock, neutrinos are passing through our body and through the earth without hitting anything. So think of the Sudbury Neutrino Collector, Canada's greatest science apparatus, the observatory there. I mean, that is to try and find out how much of these particles from the cosmos, from exploded stars, are moving through our bodies. I mean, we are flooded with the cosmos, as we're standing around this rock and thinking about time. Hillary, I'm going to go back then and quickly conclude this because I want to appreciate the boundaries on time here. But as we're walking through this area, it's so pristine. There are no dead tree branches on the ground. It's so manicured. In the old maps, it says it's a college park, and it is a parkscape, isn't it? When I think of Blenheim Palace, where the Marlborough family are outside Oxford, there's a World Heritage Site in the remote area of the grounds where these majestic oak trees have fallen. Here's one of them. Now they're allowing them to decay into the soil. And that's what you really need. I mean, these are starving environments. I mean, it looks natural to us, but it's not. It's monocultural, highly groomed, and it's lacking nutrients because it's not a old growth forest with dead trees. So it's highly manicured park space, a gentleman's park space with the creek coming through. So a bit artificial, even though quite fun to visit. I want to remind you, I'm showing you these buildings, but there are washrooms at University College, and we're going to end up at Hart House in that area. But you have to think about your students' needs as we're going through. We get into Queen's Park, and then I want them to look at, can you find 5 species of oak? Well, a lot of the trees are labeled, so it's not that hard, but you give them this handout. They love doing it. You could do the tree drawing activity here. And then they find, okay, there are also wonderful London plane trees and other trees. It's a wonderful place to experience one of our urban forests, as well as seeing walnut trees. You get down to King's College Circle, again, washrooms, coffee shops, good place to stop. That's one of the U of T's largest projects now, the largest geothermal project going in here at King's College Circle, where they bore deep down into the earth and then through thermal induction create energy. And then they're replanting some 300 trees in this area and adding more cherry blossom trees, making it a more pedestrian space. So Hillary, you've been part of the climate action plan that our dean has initiated, and it's also across the campus. This is great to see that through the efforts of many of our faculty like John Robertson, we're actually trying to do something on our campus to improve the environment and then make it a little bit more of a green space, a more sustainable space. So thank you so much, Hillary, and thank you, participants. I don't know if you can take any questions at this point or if we have time.
We do have time for a few questions if there are any. I know that Amico's just posted the handout. Thank you so much, Jeff, for sharing that. I know you've shared some fantastic resources with everybody in the session. Are there any more questions? Are there any questions that you'd like to?
Jeff, it sounds like you're a teacher educator. How are your teachers responding and replicating these kinds of awesome practices and stories inspired by place to their work?
Oh, they're doing an amazing job. Thanks, Bruce. And I enjoyed your talk the other day as well. No, they're really taking to it. And again, doing it in a very diverse way. I had one student went under the 401 to create a soundscape, and record it. He was in music. So they're all finding their entry point into this and finding, hey, this is really great. I can do this. And I don't want to write a paper during COVID, right? So, I think, place-based education is really a fun thing to do. Hillary mentioned I did this with a group of professors at Oxford. I said, let's get out of the lecture hall. Let's go look at a oak tree and talk about it. So we stood around it and did these activities, and they enjoyed doing the drawing activity as well. You think about it, children get to draw, but do adults, do professors ever get to do a drawing activity? For a lot of them, it was really new. And this one was, let's go touch the tree. So getting out and experiencing nature, really special thing. So I don't know if I answered your question adequately, but it seems to be one of the more popular things, and a number of them mention this in their yearbooks or in their course evaluations, that this resonates with them. So I highly encourage you, to think about doing that. If you have a place on your school grounds or a local park, you can get permission to go there. Get out and do it, especially during COVID.
And there's a question from Kathy in the chat that says, have you read any forest bathing books? And if so, can you recommend one?
Forest bathing books?
Yeah.
Well, I did mention that Global Forest is Diane Beresford-Kroeger's book. I don't seem to have it here now, but Global Forest is where she talks about that. But then also Call of the Forest is her documentary. And then she takes you out and shows it to you. And then she illustrates how alpha and beta pinene are being released in these aerosol gases. So, I mean, that's to me the best resource. Look at Call of the Forest. I was at a book festival where she was supposed to talk, and we were sharing that with a group of young people, and a group of 11-year-old girls formed a club, and then they started promoting giving tree saplings out to people and raising money to plant trees. I mean, so it's amazing how that can inspire young people to take action. So not just as kind of edutainment, but saying, okay, now I think, and that's what her call is, we need to reforest the planet. There used to be 6 trillion trees on this planet. Humans have helped whittle it down to 3 trillion. But we need probably a couple trillion more to help starting to, it's not the panacea, it doesn't solve the whole problem. We need to cut our emissions, obviously, but that would be one thing we could do. Thanks, Sandra. I think you've got 100 acres of forest that you're managing. I have a tiny woodlot. But yeah, that's one of the areas where we need more urban forests to get involved. And the students ask about that. Can we go out tree planting? You need to get permission. Some of my students wanted to go plant trees in Philosopher's Walk. I said, no, the university will cut them out.
Yeah, they'll go right over them with a mower. You're absolutely
They will,
right.
yeah. So, but do it, you know. And so I look at where my children planted trees in the local forest here, and now they're mature trees. And I thought, wow, isn't that cool that you did that as students? So we can all be part of the solution.
That's a fabulous place to end this session. I love the idea of going out and having, well, with permission, planting trees on school grounds with our students. I think that's such a lovely legacy to leave. So Jeff, with that, we've come to the end of our session. What a fabulous walk you've taken us on this afternoon. Thank you so much. Your knowledge in so many fields continues to astound me. It's just, it's so impressive. And you've introduced, I think, all of us to such rich ideas that we could take forward and either use in our classrooms or in the community organizations that we work with. So if everybody can join me in thanking Jeff today.
Thank you, Hillary.
And could I also please